What would you do if you witnessed a brutal murder, and the only escape led you to knock on the door of the most dangerous man in the city? Today, I'm going to tell you the incredible true story of Rachel Morgan, a pediatric nurse who thought she was having just another late-night shift at Manhattan General Hospital. But when she left work at 3 a.m. and took a shortcut through the wrong alley, she witnessed something that changed her life forever. In her desperate attempt to escape ruthless killers, Rachel knocked on what she thought was her friend's apartment door. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with Matteo Ricci, a 42-year-old Italian Mafia boss who took one look at her terrified face and made a declaration that would alter both their destinies. From now on, you live here. This story has everything. Brutal crime, life or death chases through dark city streets, a mysterious protector with deadly secrets, and a love that grew from the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. Rachel Morgan pushed through the heavy glass doors of Manhattan General Hospital, her scrubs wrinkled and her feet aching after a particularly difficult 12-hour shift in the pediatric intensive care unit. At 28, she had been a nurse for 6 years, but tonight had tested even her experienced reserves of compassion and energy. She had spent the evening caring for 7-year-old Miguel, who had been brought in after a car accident that had also claimed his mother's life. The boy was stable now, but he would wake up tomorrow to a world where everything had changed. And Rachel's heart broke thinking about the conversation someone would have to have with him. The shift had been particularly brutal even by pediatric ICU standards. Besides Miguel, Rachel had also treated a 4-year-old girl named Sophie, who had been admitted with suspicious injuries that suggested abuse, and twin babies who had been born prematurely to a mother addicted to opioids. Each case represented a different kind of tragedy, a different failure of the systems that were supposed to protect the most vulnerable. Rachel had gone into nursing because she wanted to heal people, to make a tangible difference in the world. But after 6 years in pediatric care, she sometimes felt like she was just applying bandages to wounds that society kept reopening. She saved the children who made it to her unit, but she couldn't save them from returning to the same dangerous environments, the same systemic problems, the same cycles of poverty and violence that had hurt them in the first place. It was 3:17 a.m., according to the large clock above the hospital's main entrance, and the city streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional taxi and the people who belonged to the night shift of urban life. Rachel normally took the subway home to her small apartment in Queens, but tonight, she was planning to stay at her friend Lisa's place in Manhattan. Lisa Chen was another pediatric nurse who lived in a converted brownstone about 15 blocks from the hospital. She had offered Rachel her couch for the night since Rachel had to be back at work by 7 a.m. for a double shift to cover for a sick colleague. It would save Rachel nearly 2 hours of commuting, and she desperately needed every minute of sleep she could get. The quickest route to Lisa's apartment led through a mixture of well-lit commercial streets and quieter residential blocks. Rachel had walked this path dozens of times over the past 3 years, usually feeling safe in the familiar neighborhood even at late hours. But tonight, exhausted and emotional from the difficult shift, she decided to take a shortcut through an alley that would shave 5 minutes off her walk. It was a decision that would change everything. The alley ran behind a row of upscale restaurants and boutique shops, connecting 2 main streets and usually serving as a delivery route during daytime hours. At 3 a.m., it was empty and poorly lit, with shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Rachel walked quickly, her sneakers silent on the asphalt, eager to get through the narrow space and back to well-lit sidewalks. She was halfway through the alley when she heard voices speaking in what sounded like Russian, coming from behind a large dumpster near the back entrance of an Italian restaurant. Rachel's first instinct was to turn around and take the long way, but curiosity and concern made her pause. What if someone was hurt? What if there was a medical emergency? Rachel moved closer, staying in the shadows, trying to determine if her help was needed. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw 3 men standing around a 4th figure who was on his knees, hands bound behind his back. Even in the dim light, Rachel could see that the kneeling man was bleeding from multiple wounds on his face and torso. His expensive suit, what had probably been a perfectly tailored Italian design hours earlier, was now torn and soaked with blood. A gold watch caught the light on his wrist, and Rachel could see that his hands were shaking as he tried to maintain his balance with his wrists bound behind his back. "Please, I have family. I have children in Moscow. They are innocent. I will pay whatever you want, 10 million, 20 million. I have accounts in Switzerland, in the Caymans." The largest of the standing men, broad-shouldered with a shaved head, and the kind of build that came from years of violence, spoke in heavily accented English. "Viktor Petrov, you had many chances to pay. You had many chances to show respect. Instead, you think you can expand into our territory, steal our businesses, corrupt our politicians. That was business, just business." Victor's voice was getting more desperate. "We can negotiate. We can find arrangement." "Time for negotiation is finished," said another of the Russians, this one thinner but with the cold eyes Rachel had seen in some of the gang members who ended up in her ER. "Boss says you are example now. Example for other families who think they can disrespect Kozlov organization." Rachel's blood turned to ice as she realized she wasn't just witnessing a murder. She was witnessing an execution that was meant to send a message to other criminal organizations. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated, political violence in a war she didn't understand. Rachel's blood turned to ice as she realized what she was witnessing. This wasn't a medical emergency. It was an execution. She needed to call 911 immediately, but as she reached for her phone, her hand bumped against the brick wall behind her, dislodging a piece of loose mortar. The small sound echoed through the alley like a gunshot. All four men turned toward her hiding place, and Rachel found herself staring directly into the eyes of the kneeling victim. In that split second, she saw his desperation, his terror, and his silent plea for help. "There!" one of the Russians shouted, pointing in her direction. "Someone is watching." Rachel didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran toward the mouth of the alley, her heart hammering against her ribs as she heard heavy footsteps pounding after her. Behind her, she could hear rapid conversations in Russian and the sound of multiple people pursuing her. As she reached the street, Rachel chanced to look over her shoulder and saw 3 men emerging from the alley, their faces hard and purposeful. One of them was speaking rapidly into a cell phone, probably calling for backup or additional resources to hunt her down. Rachel ran harder than she had ever run in her life, her nursing bag bouncing against her hip as she sprinted down the sidewalk. Her sneakers pounded against the concrete, and she could hear her own ragged breathing mixing with the sound of heavy footsteps pursuing her. She had witnessed a murder, or at least, she had been seconds away from witnessing one, and the killers had seen her face clearly enough to identify her. The Russians were gaining on her, their longer strides and obvious physical training giving them an advantage over a woman who spent her days on her feet, but rarely engaged in this kind of intense cardio. Rachel could hear their voices coordinating the pursuit, speaking in rapid Russian that she couldn't understand, but that clearly concerned strategy for capturing her. Manhattan at 3:30 a.m. was a different world from the daytime city Rachel knew. The streets that bustled with activity during business hours were now nearly empty, populated only by the occasional taxi, late shift workers heading home, and the kind of people who preferred the cover of darkness for their activities. The bright lights and crowded sidewalks that might have offered safety during the day were replaced by long stretches of shadow and silence. Rachel's mind raced as she ran, trying to remember the quickest route to Lisa's apartment, while also scanning for any signs of safety. A police car, a 24-hour business with security, even just well-lit areas with security cameras that might deter her pursuers. But the neighborhood she was running through was primarily residential, filled with expensive brownstones and luxury apartment buildings, whose wealthy occupants were sound asleep behind secured doors. Lisa's apartment was still 8 blocks away, but Rachel remembered that the route took her through several well-lit commercial areas where there might be security cameras or late-night businesses with people who could help her. She just had to stay ahead of her pursuers long enough to reach safety. But as Rachel turned onto a side street that she thought led toward Lisa's neighborhood, she realized she had made a mistake. In her panic and exhaustion, she had gotten turned around. The street she was on was residential, lined with expensive brownstones and luxury apartment buildings. But there were no open businesses, no security guards, no signs of life that might offer protection. Behind her, the Russian voices were getting closer. Rachel saw a tall, modern apartment building with an elegant facade and expensive-looking entrance. The heavy glass door was slightly ajar. Someone had probably just entered or left, and the automatic lock hadn't engaged yet. Without thinking, Rachel darted toward the building and slipped inside. The lobby was beautifully appointed with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than Rachel made in a year. But she barely noticed the luxury as she ran toward the stairs, taking them two at a time in her desperate flight from the men who were hunting her. Rachel climbed floor after floor, her lungs burning and her legs aching, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. She could hear the building's front door opening behind her, could hear voices in the lobby speaking in Russian. They had followed her inside. She kept climbing, past the 3rd floor, past the 5th, past the 7th, not stopping until she reached what appeared to be the top of the building. There was only one door on the landing, a heavy wooden door with brass fixtures that suggested this was the building's penthouse apartment. Rachel pounded on the door with both fists, not caring about the noise, not caring about disturbing whoever lived there, caring only about getting inside and away from the men who were climbing the stairs behind her. "Please," she called out, continuing to bang on the door. "Please, someone help me. There are men trying to hurt me." She could hear footsteps on the stairs, getting closer with each passing second. Rachel pounded harder on the door, tears streaming down her face as she realized she might be trapped. Then the door opened. The man who stood in the doorway was not what Rachel had expected from a penthouse resident awakened at 3:30 a.m. by frantic pounding on his door. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that showed distinguished silver at the temples, olive skin that spoke of Mediterranean heritage, and the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention even in pajama pants and a fitted t-shirt. His body, visible through the thin fabric of his shirt, was clearly that of someone who maintained himself with disciplined exercise, not the gym-sculpted physique of someone trying to impress, but the practical strength of someone whose life might depend on physical capability. There was a small scar above his left eyebrow, and another along his jawline that suggested he had seen violence before. But it was his eyes that stopped Rachel's breath. Dark brown, almost black, with an intensity that seemed to take in everything about her situation in a single glance. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly and accurately, someone who missed nothing and revealed little. More importantly, they were the eyes of someone who, upon seeing a terrified woman at his door in the middle of the night, immediately shifted into protective mode rather than suspicion or annoyance. The apartment behind him was stunning in a way that spoke of both wealth and sophisticated taste. Rachel caught glimpses of floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city, expensive furniture that looked both beautiful and comfortable, and artwork that appeared to be museum quality rather than decorator-chosen pieces. But everything had a lived-in quality that suggested this was a home, not just a showcase. "Per favore," Rachel gasped in broken Italian she had learned from working with immigrant families at the hospital. "Help me. There are men. They want to hurt me." The man's eyes moved past Rachel to the stairwell, and she could see his expression change as he heard the footsteps and voices approaching. His jaw tightened, and something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. "Get inside," he said in accented English, his voice carrying an authority that made obedience seem automatic. "Now." Rachel stumbled into the apartment, and the man closed the door behind her, engaging multiple locks with practiced efficiency. The apartment was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city. Expensive furniture filled the spacious rooms, and everything spoke of wealth and sophisticated taste. But Rachel barely noticed the luxury. She was too busy trying to catch her breath and process what was happening. "What did you see?" the man asked, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. There were men in an alley. Russians, I think. They had someone. They were going to kill him." They saw me watching." The man nodded grimly, as if this information confirmed something he had suspected. "How many men?" "3 that I saw, but one was on the phone when they started chasing me. There might be more." Before the man could respond, there was a loud banging on the apartment door. Rachel jumped, but her host seemed unsurprised. "Open door!" a heavily accented voice demanded from the hallway. "We know girl is inside." Rachel looked at the man in terror, but he appeared completely calm. He moved to what looked like an antique desk and pulled out something that made Rachel's blood run cold. A gun. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "And whatever happens, do not speak unless I tell you to." The banging continued, accompanied by threats in both Russian and broken English. Rachel pressed herself against the wall, watching as the man checked his weapon with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this was not his first encounter with armed criminals. "Listen carefully," he said to Rachel without taking his eyes off the door. "My name is Matteo Ricci. This is my home. Those men outside are my enemies, and they will not leave here alive if they try to enter." The name meant nothing to Rachel, but the way he said it, with quiet certainty and absolute authority, made her understand that she was no longer in immediate danger. "But after tonight," Matteo continued, "they will know you were here. They will know you saw their faces. They will know you can identify them." Rachel felt her heart sink as she realized the implications. "They'll come after me." "Yes. Which means your old life is over." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Matteo turned to look at her directly, and Rachel saw something in his eyes that was both protective and possessive. "From now on, you live here." Rachel stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. "I can't. I have a job. I have an apartment. I have a life." "Had," Matteo corrected gently. "You had those things. Now you have something more important. You have protection." The banging on the door had stopped, replaced by quieter sounds that suggested the Russians were trying to find another way into the apartment. Matteo moved toward the windows, peering down at the street through what Rachel now realized were bulletproof glass. "They are regrouping," he said matter-of-factly. "Calling for backup, probably. But they will not try to force entry tonight. They know better." "Know better than what?" Matteo smiled, but it wasn't reassuring. "Know better than to start a war they cannot win." Over the next hour, Rachel learned exactly who had opened his door to her, and the revelation was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Matteo Ricci was the head of one of New York's oldest Italian-American crime families, a man whose influence extended throughout Manhattan's business and political communities. The Ricci family had been operating in New York for nearly a century, evolving from Prohibition-era bootleggers to a sophisticated organization that controlled everything from waste management to construction contracts to high-end restaurants. "We are not the mafia you see in movies," Matteo explained, as he made coffee with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the night's events. "We do not run around shooting people in the streets or leaving bodies in the harbor. We are businessmen who happen to operate in areas where the line between legal and illegal is flexible." The Russians who had been chasing Rachel belonged to the Kozlov organization, a newer, more brutal group that had been trying to expand their influence from Brighton Beach into Manhattan's more lucrative territories. Unlike the traditional Italian families, who operated according to codes of honor and respect that had been developed over generations, the Russians were known for their willingness to use extreme violence and their disregard for the unwritten rules that kept the criminal underworld from descending into open warfare. "The man you saw in the alley," Matteo continued, settling into a chair across from Rachel with his coffee. "His name was Viktor Petrov. He was actually a reasonable man, for a Russian. He had been trying to negotiate some kind of arrangement between our organizations to find a way for the Kozlovs to operate in New York without stepping on established territories." "So they killed him for trying to make peace?" They killed him because someone higher up in their organization decided that negotiation was weakness. The Kozlovs prefer to take what they want, rather than ask for it. Rachel sat on Matteo's expensive couch, still wearing her scrubs, trying to comprehend that she was having coffee at 4 a.m. with a confessed criminal who had just saved her life. So they killed him? Almost certainly. And now you are the only witness to their crime. Which means they'll keep coming after me. Which means I will keep protecting you. Rachel looked around the luxurious apartment, at the man who spoke of violence and protection with equal calm, at the life she had stumbled into through a combination of bad timing and worse luck. I can't stay here. I don't know you. This isn't my world. Matteo set down his coffee cup and studied Rachel's face. What is your world, cara mia? 12-hour shifts caring for sick children? A small apartment where you live alone? Friends you see once a week if you're lucky? The accurate description of her life stung more than Rachel wanted to admit. At least it's my life. At least I'm free. Free to be hunted by Russian killers? Free to be murdered because you happen to witness their crime? Rachel had no answer for that. Let me tell you about freedom, Matteo continued, his voice gentle but firm. Freedom is having the power to protect yourself and the people you care about. Freedom is not having to look over your shoulder every time you walk down the street. Freedom is knowing that when someone threatens you, there are consequences. That's not freedom, Rachel said. That's just a different kind of prison. Perhaps. But it is a prison where you are safe, respected, and valued. Can you say the same about the life you are trying to return to? Rachel thought about her apartment in Queens, about her job at the hospital, about the constant financial stress, and the loneliness that had become the background noise of her existence. I need time to think, she said finally. Time is exactly what you do not have, Matteo replied. By tomorrow, the Russians will know your name, your address, your workplace. They will know everything about you that can be discovered through public records and social media. So what are you suggesting? I am not suggesting anything. I am telling you that you will stay here, under my protection, until this situation is resolved. The way he said it, not as a request but as a statement of fact, made Rachel bristle. You can't just decide that. You can't just declare that I live here now. Matteo's expression softened slightly. Rachel, look at me. Really look at me. Rachel met his dark eyes and saw something that surprised her. Genuine concern, even tenderness. I am not keeping you here because I want to control you. I am keeping you here because if you leave, you will be dead within 48 hours. The Russians do not leave witnesses alive, especially witnesses who can identify them in the murder of a high-ranking member of a rival organization. The stark truth of his words hit Rachel like cold water. But if I stay here, what happens to my life? My job? My friends? Your job will be told that you have a family emergency and need extended leave. Your friends will be told that you are visiting relatives out of state. Your apartment will be maintained, and your bills will be paid. But you cannot return to any of those things until the threat is eliminated. And how long will that take? Matteo's smile was grim. That depends on how quickly I can find the men who saw you tonight. Rachel spent the rest of the night in Matteo's guest bedroom, lying awake and staring at the ceiling while trying to process the complete transformation of her existence. 24 hours ago, her biggest concern had been getting enough sleep between shifts. Now she was a witness to attempted murder, living under the protection of a mafia boss who had unilaterally decided her fate. But as the hours passed and exhaustion finally began to overcome anxiety, Rachel found herself thinking about Matteo's questions about her old life. Was she really free when she lived paycheck to paycheck? When she worked herself to exhaustion? When she had no one to call in an emergency except colleagues who were equally overworked and overwhelmed? When she finally fell asleep as dawn was breaking over the city, Rachel's dreams were filled with Russian voices and dark alleys, but also with the memory of dark eyes that had seen her terror and immediately moved to shield her from danger. Rachel woke up 12 hours later to the smell of something incredible cooking. She found Matteo in the kitchen, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, preparing what looked like a gourmet meal with the same calm efficiency he had shown while handling armed criminals. "Buongiorno, Bella," he said without turning around. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Rachel admitted. "What are you making?" "Osso buco, my nonna's recipe. I thought you might be hungry." Rachel realized she hadn't eaten since before her shift the previous day, nearly 20 hours ago. "I should call the hospital," she said. "Let them know I won't be in for my shift." "Already handled. You have been granted emergency family leave for personal reasons. Your supervisor was very understanding." Rachel stared at him. "How did you—" "I have people who handle such arrangements. Your job is secure, and your absence will not raise suspicions." "What about Lisa? She'll be worried when I don't show up." "Lisa Chen received a text from your phone explaining that you had to leave town unexpectedly for a family emergency. She wished you well, and said to call when you can." The casual mention of details about her personal life made Rachel realize just how much power Matteo wielded and how quickly he had moved to secure her story. "You've thought of everything." "It is what I do. I protect people, and protection requires attention to detail." As they ate lunch, the ossobuco was incredible, better than anything Rachel had ever tasted. She found herself studying Matteo more carefully. He was handsome in a mature, sophisticated way that was completely different from the younger men she usually found attractive. But more than his appearance, it was his presence that drew her attention. He moved with quiet confidence, spoke with natural authority, and seemed genuinely interested in her comfort and well-being. "Can I ask you something?" Rachel said. "Of course." "Why are you doing this? Really? You could have just called the police when I knocked on your door. You could have let them handle the Russians." Matteo was quiet for a moment, considering his answer, and Rachel could see pain flicker across his features. 3 years ago, I lost my wife to men who wanted to hurt me. She was everything good in my life. A teacher who worked with immigrant children, helping them learn English and adapt to American schools. She knew about my business, but she was never part of it. She was completely innocent of everything except loving someone in my position. Matteo's voice grew quieter, more distant. "The Bratva, a different Russian organization than the Kozlovs. They kidnapped her to use as leverage against me in a business dispute. They wanted me to give up 3 blocks of territory in Little Italy, businesses that had been under our protection for 40 years. Rachel felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice, but she remained silent, sensing that this was a story Matteo rarely told. "I gave them everything they asked for, immediately. Territory, money, even some of my own people as collateral. But it wasn't enough. They had decided that humiliating me publicly would send a stronger message to other families than simply getting what they wanted." Matteo stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "They kept her for 3 days. When we finally found where they were holding her..." His voice broke slightly. "She had been beaten, tortured, violated. She died in my arms in the hospital, and her last words were an apology for causing me trouble." Rachel felt tears welling in her eyes. "Matteo, I'm so sorry. That's unimaginable. I spent the next 6 months hunting down every person involved in her death. Not just the ones who took her, but the ones who ordered it. The ones who knew about it. The ones who could have prevented it but chose not to. 23 people died because they took Maria from me." The casual mention of such extensive revenge should have terrified Rachel, but instead, she found herself thinking about how far she would go to protect someone she loved, and whether the men who had tortured an innocent woman to death had deserved mercy. "After that," Matteo continued, "I swore that I would never again allow an innocent person to be harmed because of the world I live in. when I saw you at my door, terrified and hunted by my enemies. I saw Maria. I saw a chance to keep a promise I made at her grave. I'm sorry, Rachel said softly. I can't imagine losing someone like that. It changes you. It makes you understand that some things are more important than law, more important than convention, more important than what other people think is right or wrong. Rachel thought about the victims she had treated in the pediatric ICU, about the families destroyed by violence and accidents and diseases that didn't discriminate between good and evil. At the hospital, I see a lot of people who get hurt because the system fails them. Kids who don't get proper medical care because their families can't afford it. Women who get beaten by men the police won't arrest. Elderly people who get scammed because there's no one to protect them. And what do you do about it? What I can, but it never feels like enough. Matteo nodded thoughtfully. That is the difference between people like you and people like me. You work within a system that is broken and try to help whoever you can reach. I work outside the system and fix problems that the system cannot or will not address. By breaking laws. By doing what needs to be done. Rachel couldn't argue with the logic, even though it challenged everything she had been taught about right and wrong. Over the following days, Rachel settled into an unexpected routine in Matteo's penthouse, and she learned that he was far more complex than she had initially understood. Yes, he was the head of a criminal organization, but he was also a man who read voraciously. His personal library included classics in Italian, English, and French, as well as biographies, philosophy, and contemporary fiction. He cooked with the passion of someone who found genuine joy in creating something beautiful and nourishing. He spoke 4 languages fluently and could discuss everything from Renaissance art to modern political theory to the finer points of winemaking. More surprisingly, he treated everyone in his orbit with genuine respect and consideration. His housekeeper, Mrs. Castellano, was an elderly Italian woman who had worked for his family for 30 years and who clearly regarded him as a beloved grandson rather than an employer. His bodyguards, Rachel learned that the men who seemed to appear and disappear around the building were not just security, but family members and longtime associates, were treated more like brothers than employees. The penthouse itself was a revelation that unfolded over days of exploration. What had initially seemed like a luxurious prison revealed itself to be a home in the fullest sense, filled with family photographs that showed 3 generations of Ricci's, from his great-grandfather's immigration papers to wedding photos of cousins and siblings. There were children's drawings stuck to the refrigerator, gifts from nieces and nephews who clearly adored their Uncle Matteo. His kitchen was a chef's dream, stocked with ingredients that spoke of someone who genuinely enjoyed cooking rather than simply having food prepared for him. The spice rack alone contained items Rachel had never heard of, imported directly from Italy and used regularly based on the wear patterns on the containers. The living areas were filled with comfortable furniture that invited relaxation rather than impressing visitors. Books were scattered on tables where they had been set down mid-reading. Blankets were draped over chairs for impromptu naps, and everything spoke of a life that was lived rather than displayed. But it was the more private spaces that revealed the most about Matteo's character. His office contained not just the expected business materials, but also framed letters from community organizations, thanking the Ricci family for donations, photographs of scholarship recipients whose educations had been funded by family money, and awards from various charities for community service. You do a lot of legitimate charitable work, Rachel observed one afternoon as she helped him organize some papers. More than you might expect, Matteo replied. Money is just a tool, Rachel. It can be used to hurt people or to help them. I prefer to help when possible. Tell me about your family, Rachel said one evening, as they shared dinner and wine that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Tell me about your family, Rachel said one evening, as they shared dinner and wine that probably cost more than her monthly salary. My great-grandfather, Salvatore Ricci, came from Sicily in 1922, Matteo began, his eyes growing distant with memory. He brought nothing but determination and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to build a better life for his children. Sicilia in those days was not a good place for honest men. The government was corrupt, the economy was destroyed by war, and people like my great-grandfather had no opportunities except what they could create for themselves. So he came to America looking for legitimate work? He tried, believe me. He had been a skilled carpenter in Sicily, could build anything from furniture to houses. But when he arrived in New York, he found that the good construction jobs went to men who had been here longer, who spoke perfect English, who looked more American than he did. Matteo poured more wine, his movements automatic as he continued the story. So Salvatore did what many immigrants did. He found work where it was available. During Prohibition, that meant moving alcohol for people who could pay well and who didn't ask questions about papers or accents or where you came from originally. Bootlegging. Bootlegging, yes, but also protection. The Italian neighborhoods were being preyed upon by Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, men who figured that immigrants wouldn't fight back. Salvatore and his friends proved them wrong. Rachel found herself leaning forward, captivated by this glimpse into a world she had only read about in history books. My grandfather, Antonio, he was the one who really built the organization into something structured. He understood that random violence was bad for business, that reputation and respect were more valuable than fear. He established territories, negotiated agreements with other families, created systems that prevented the kind of wars that destroyed neighborhoods. And your father? My father, Giuseppe, he modernized everything. Moved us into legitimate businesses, got involved in politics and community development. By the time I took over, we owned restaurants, construction companies, waste management firms. The illegal activities became a smaller and smaller part of what we did. But they didn't disappear entirely. No, Matteo admitted, because there are always problems that cannot be solved through legal means. People who prey on the vulnerable, corrupt officials who cannot be voted out of office. Businesses that exploit workers because they know no one will stop them. Rachel thought about her own family, hardworking, law-abiding people who had struggled constantly with bills, health problems, and systems that seemed designed to keep them down. Do you ever think about getting out? Living a normal life? Matteo's expression grew distant. After Maria died, I considered it, but then I realized that normal life had nothing to offer me. My family, my responsibilities, my ability to help people. That is what gives my existence meaning. And what about personal happiness? Love? Children? I had love. I lost it. As for children, Matteo shrugged. It would not be fair to bring children into this world, to make them targets for people who want to hurt me. Rachel felt a pang of sadness at the resignation in his voice. That's a lonely way to live. It is the price of power, and until recently, I thought it was a price I was willing to pay. The way he said, "until recently," made Rachel's heart skip. But before she could respond, Matteo's phone rang with a tone that made his expression immediately serious. "Excuse me," he said, answering the call and speaking in rapid Italian. Rachel couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the tension in Matteo's voice, could see the way his jaw tightened as he listened to whatever news he was receiving. When he hung up, his expression was grim. "They have found 2 of the 3 Russians who chased you. My people are handling the situation." Rachel felt a chill. Handling it how? In a way that ensures they will never threaten you again. Rachel understood what he meant, and the knowledge made her feel simultaneously safer and more complicit in violence than she had ever imagined possible. What about the 3rd man? Still searching, but he will be found. That night, Rachel lay in bed thinking about the men who had hunted her, who were now dead because of decisions made on her behalf. She should have felt horrified by the violence being committed in her name, but instead, she felt something closer to relief, mixed with a complex understanding of justice that her previous life had never required her to consider. For the first time in her adult life, someone was ensuring her safety with absolute certainty. Someone was willing to do whatever was necessary to protect her, without asking anything in return except that she allow herself to be protected. The next morning, Rachel met more members of Matteo's extended family when his sister Francesca arrived for what appeared to be a regular breakfast meeting. Francesca Ricci was a woman in her late 30s, with the same dark eyes and commanding presence as her brother. But where Matteo's authority was quiet and controlled, Francesca's was sharp and direct. She was elegantly dressed in a way that suggested both wealth and serious business responsibilities, and she greeted Rachel with the kind of immediate assessment that reminded Rachel of the head nurses who ran hospital departments with iron efficiency. "So you are the nurse who has captured my brother's attention," Francesca said without preamble, settling at the breakfast table with the casual familiarity of someone who had been having meals in this apartment for decades. "I wouldn't say I captured anything," Rachel replied carefully. "I was in trouble, and Matteo helped me. Matteo helps many people. He does not usually invite them to live in his home indefinitely." Francesca's smile was knowing but not unkind. "I am curious about what makes you different." Over breakfast, Rachel learned that Francesca managed the family's legitimate business interests, a portfolio that included restaurants, construction companies, import-export firms, and real estate development projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had an MBA from Columbia and spoke with the kind of sharp business acumen that would have been impressive in any corporate boardroom. "People think that families like ours are just about violence and intimidation," Francesca explained as she reviewed some contracts that needed Matteo's signature. "But the reality is that we are primarily business people. The violence, when it occurs, is usually about protecting our business interests from people who think they can take what we have built." "Like the Russians?" "Exactly like the Russians. They see successful Italian businesses and think they can simply take them over through intimidation and murder. They do not understand that our success comes from generations of relationship building, community trust, and genuine value creation." Rachel watched the siblings work together, noting the easy collaboration and obvious mutual respect. Whatever moral complexities surrounded their business activities, it was clear that the Ricci family operated as a genuine partnership built on love and loyalty. 2 weeks later, Matteo informed Rachel that the last of the Russians had been located and dealt with. She was safe to return to her old life if she chose to do so. "And if I don't choose to?" Rachel asked. They were sitting on Matteo's balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below them, sharing a bottle of wine and the kind of comfortable silence that had developed between them over their time together. "If you don't choose to return to your old life, then we figure out what your new life looks like." "Together?" Matteo turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "Rachel, these past 2 weeks with you have been the first time since Maria died that I have felt truly alive. You make me remember what it means to care for someone, to want to be better, to hope for things I thought were no longer possible." Rachel felt her heart racing. "Matteo, I know this is not the life you planned. I know my world is dangerous and complicated and morally ambiguous. But I also know that you are safer with me than you could ever be without me, and I am better with you than I have ever been without you." Rachel thought about her apartment in Queens, empty and waiting for her return. She thought about her job at the hospital, meaningful but exhausting and ultimately limited in its impact. She thought about the loneliness that had been her constant companion for years. Then she looked at the man who had saved her life, who had shown her a different way of living, who had spent 2 weeks treating her with more respect and genuine care than she had received from anyone in years. What would it mean exactly? Staying here, being part of your life? It would mean being cherished instead of just appreciated. It would mean having resources to help people in ways you never imagined possible. It would mean living without fear, without financial stress, without the constant struggle to survive. And in return, you give me something I thought I had lost forever. A reason to come home, someone to protect and care for. A future that includes more than just duty and responsibility. Rachel stood up and moved to the balcony railing, looking out over the city where her old life waited for her. Then she turned back to Matteo. seeing in his eyes the same hope and vulnerability she felt in her own heart. "I need you to promise me something," she said. "Anything. Promise me that if I stay, it's because I choose to stay. Not because I'm trapped, not because I'm afraid to leave, but because this is where I want to be." Matteo stood and moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "I promise you that every day you stay will be because you choose me, just as I choose you." When Rachel kissed him, it was with the certainty of someone who had found exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Rachel Morgan Ricci stood in the pediatric wing of a new children's hospital that bore the Ricci family name, watching as the latest group of young patients enjoyed art therapy sessions in a room filled with natural light and child-friendly furniture that had been designed specifically for healing. The hospital was one of several charitable projects that Matteo had undertaken since Rachel joined his life, ways of using his resources and influence for unambiguously positive purposes. Rachel had been instrumental in designing the facility and recruiting staff, using her medical background to create something that filled gaps in the city's healthcare system. The children's hospital was just the beginning. They had also established a scholarship program for nursing students from immigrant families, funded a free clinic that provided healthcare to undocumented workers, and started a foundation that helped victims of domestic violence find safe housing and legal representation. "You know," Rachel said as they watched a group of young patients laugh at a puppet show being performed by volunteer entertainers. "6 months ago, I thought the most I could ever do to help people was one patient at a time, one shift at a time. And now I'm helping to create systems that will help thousands of people over decades. Children who will grow up healthier because they had access to this hospital, young women who will become nurses because they got scholarships, families who will survive domestic violence because they found safe shelter." It was work that satisfied Rachel in ways her hospital job never had, not because treating individual patients wasn't meaningful, but because she could now address the systemic problems that created so many of the cases she had seen in the pediatric ICU. "Admiring your work?" Matteo asked, joining her at the observation window. "Our work," Rachel corrected. "I never could have imagined something like this when I was working those 12-hour shifts at Manhattan General." The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now doing more unambiguously good work than she ever had in her legitimate career, funded by money that came from sources the law would consider questionable. But the children being treated in this hospital didn't care about the moral complexities of their funding. They cared about receiving care that their families could afford. "And do you miss it? Your old life?" Rachel thought about the question seriously. She missed some things. The immediate satisfaction of hands-on patient care, the straightforward morality of medical treatment, the simplicity of problems that could be solved with medications and procedures. But she didn't miss the exhaustion, the constant financial stress, the loneliness, or the feeling that she could never do enough to make a real difference. "And do you miss it? Your old life?" Rachel thought about the question seriously, because Matteo had asked it before and deserved an honest answer. She missed some things. The immediate satisfaction of hands-on patient care, the straightforward morality of medical treatment, where helping people was always the right choice, the simplicity of problems that could be solved with medications and procedures. But she didn't miss the exhaustion that had become so constant. She had forgotten what it felt like to wake up rested. She didn't miss the financial stress that had colored every decision, from whether she could afford to replace her worn-out shoes to whether she could take time off when she was sick. She didn't miss the loneliness of coming home to an empty apartment after particularly difficult shifts, with no one to talk to about the children she hadn't been able to save. Most of all, she didn't miss the feeling of powerlessness that had defined her old life, the knowledge that for every child she helped, there were dozens more being hurt by systems she was too small and too poor to change. "I miss parts of it," Rachel said honestly. "But I don't miss feeling like I was fighting a war I could never win, treating symptoms of problems I could never address." "And the moral complications? The knowledge that some of our resources come from activities that your old life would have considered wrong?" It was the question that had kept Rachel awake for weeks when she first decided to stay with Matteo, the ethical dilemma that she had turned over in her mind countless times. "I've decided that morality isn't as simple as I used to think it was," Rachel said slowly. "When I was working at Manhattan General, I treated gang members who had been shot by rival gangs. I treated children who had been abused by parents who were never prosecuted because the system failed to protect them. I treated elderly people who had been beaten and robbed because the police couldn't prevent crime in their neighborhoods. And what did you conclude? That good intentions aren't enough if you don't have the power to create real change. That sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong, but between different kinds of imperfect solutions." Rachel paused, watching a group of children who were alive and healthy because of the hospital she and Matteo had created. "Your family uses questionable methods, yes, but the results speak for themselves. This hospital will save more lives in a year than I saved in my entire nursing career." Matteo slipped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest, and Rachel felt the kind of security she had never known existed before that terrifying night when she had knocked on his door. "Any regrets about knocking on the wrong door?" he asked, echoing a question that had become something of a running joke between them. Rachel leaned into his warmth, thinking about that desperate flight through dark streets, the panic that had driven her to pound on a stranger's door, the split-second decision that had changed everything. "Just one," she said. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me 28 years and a brush with death to realize that sometimes the wrong choice leads you to exactly the right place." As they stood together watching children play safely in a hospital that existed because of their partnership, Rachel thought about the strange journey that had brought her from an overworked, underpaid, lonely nurse to a woman who could change systems, save lives on a massive scale, and sleep every night in the arms of a man who would literally kill to protect her. It wasn't the life she had planned, and it certainly wasn't the conventional path she had been raised to follow. But it was a life that had meaning beyond anything she had ever imagined possible, built on love that was stronger than any moral complication, and secured by a partnership that transformed both of their worlds. Sometimes, Rachel reflected, the most important doors are the ones you knock on by accident, in the middle of the night, while running from dangers you never expected to face. And sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is exactly the person you need to save you. Not just from external threats, but from a life that was too small for your capacity to love and help and change the world. That's the story of Rachel Morgan, the pediatric nurse who knocked on the wrong door while fleeing for her life, and found herself face to face with a man who changed everything with 5 simple words. "From now on, you live here." Her story proves that love can grow from the most unlikely circumstances, that protection comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is exactly the one who can offer you the safety you never knew you needed. Rachel and Matteo's love story reminds us that home isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you end up when life takes an unexpected turn, and sometimes the wrong door leads to exactly the right life. If this incredible story captivated you, and you want to hear more amazing tales of unexpected protection, life-changing mistakes, and love that conquers all obstacles, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We share new stories every week about real people who discovered that fate has a way of leading us exactly where we need to be, even when we're running from danger. What did you think of Rachel and Matteo's story? Have you ever made a mistake that turned out to be the best thing that happened to you? Would you have stayed with Matteo or returned to your old life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories resonate with your own experiences of unexpected love, life-changing decisions, and finding home in the most unlikely places. Remember, sometimes when you're running from one danger, you run straight into the arms of your destiny. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.